At 07:42 a.m., somewhere over New Guinea, March 1943, the engine's scream fills everything. Lieutenant Jack Turner grips the yoke of his B-17, sweat pooling beneath his flight gloves. Below, the jungle sprawls endless and dark, swallowing light. The payload bay holds something experimental, fertilizer compounds mixed with fuel oil, unstable chemistry born from desperation. Over the radio, static breaks. 12 minutes, Jack. Hit the zone clean. His co-pilot checks the instruments, but Turner's mind drifts to a briefing 2 days prior. A major had mentioned supply shortages, improvised solutions, agricultural chemicals repurposed for war. Turner had laughed then. Now, banking through humid air toward the drop coordinates, the absurdity feels heavier. At 07:46 a.m., the bay doors open. The payload falls. 4 seconds later, the jungle erupts. A fireball that climbs higher than anyone predicted, shaking the bomber's frame. Turner pulls altitude, hands trembling. Below, the blast radius spreads like a terrible flower. What began as a farmer's mistake has just entered the war. The heat pressed down on William Taylor's fields in June 1941, the Ohio soil cracked and thirsting. He stood beneath an oak tree, wiping his neck with a rag already damp from the morning. His fertilizer supplies had run low weeks earlier, and the distributor couldn't promise shipments until fall. On the workbench sat barrels of chemicals, ammonium nitrate, potash, superphosphate, a few containers with faded labels. Taylor had farmed for 23 years and trusted his instincts more than formulas. He mixed by eye, scooping white crystals and grey powder into a drum, adding ratios that felt right. The blend smelled sharp, chemical. He stirred it with a wooden paddle, noting the texture. Too coarse. He added diesel fuel to help it spread, watching the mixture darken and clump. It looked wrong, sloppy, but the crops needed feeding. He hauled the barrel to the spreader and worked the north field until dusk. The corn grew well that summer. Taylor never thought about the mixture again. By autumn, military procurement officers were surveying farms across the Midwest, cataloguing everything from grain stores to chemical inventories. Taylor's barn was inspected in late September. An officer noted the fertilizer stocks, the unusual mixture ratio, and filed the report without comment. The paperwork traveled to Washington in a canvas sack. One form among thousands. No one flagged it. No one questioned the blend. It became entry 73 in a logistics database, a footnote in wartime accounting. Taylor planted winter wheat and forgot the inspection ever happened. In Washington during February 1942, Captain Ethan Bell reviewed supply manifests in a cramped office near the War Department. The reports stacked higher each week, requests for steel, rubber, explosives, fuel. Ammunition production was climbing, but raw materials lagged. Bell circled shortages in red ink. Ammonium, nitrate, TNT precursors, glycerin. The numbers didn't balance. Factories were running triple shifts, but the European and Pacific theaters consumed ordnance faster than domestic plants could manufacture it. Bell's superior, Colonel Marcus Hale, dropped another file on his desk in early March. It contained agricultural surveys from the previous autumn, thousands of farms catalogued for potential resource conversion. Bell flipped through page after page of crop yields, livestock counts, chemical inventories. Most entries were standard: nitrogen compounds, phosphates, lime. Then he paused. A farm in Ohio had reported a custom fertilizer blend, high in ammonium nitrate, mixed with diesel fuel for distribution. The ratio was unusual, almost reckless. Bell made a note and moved on. 2 weeks later, an explosion at a munitions plant in Pennsylvania killed 11 workers and halted production for a month. The blast originated in a storage facility where ammonium nitrate was improperly stored near fuel drums. Investigators documented the site, photographed the crater, measured the blast radius. Bell read the report and thought of the Ohio farm. He retrieved the agricultural file and compared the mixtures. The ratios were nearly identical. He wrote a memo suggesting further investigation into agricultural-grade explosives. The memo reached an ordnance research team in April. They filed it under low-priority inquiry. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fletcher walked through a military depot outside Washington in August 1942, inspecting shipments that had arrived from civilian suppliers. Fertilizer bags were stacked near the south wall, requisitioned from farms whose owners had entered military service. Fletcher checked labels against inventory sheets, noting discrepancies. Most bags were standard commercial blends, unremarkable. But one pallet held 40 bags with handwritten markings, lot numbers, ratios, a farm name in Ohio. Fletcher opened one bag and examined the contents. The mixture was granular, darker than standard fertilizer, with a faint petroleum smell. He consulted the inventory sheet. The blend contained 65% ammonium nitrate, 20% fuel oil, 15% filler compounds. Fletcher had supervised demolitions training before his logistics assignment. He recognized explosive potential when he saw it. He ordered the pallet moved to a testing area behind the depot. A small team of engineers set up a controlled experiment, placing 5 pounds of the mixture in a steel drum and detonating it with a blasting cap. The explosion was sharp, focused, more powerful than equivalent weights of standard military explosives. The drum fragmented into shrapnel. The blast cratered the dirt. Fletcher documented everything: mixture composition, detonation velocity, blast pressure. He wrote a 3-page report and sent it to the Army Ordnance Department. Within 2 weeks, he received orders to secure all remaining bags of the mixture and forward samples to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Fletcher complied. The test there confirmed his findings. The fertilizer blend, accidental and unsophisticated, produced reliable explosive force at a fraction of the cost of military-grade compounds. Production authorization came in October. By November, contracts were issued to agricultural suppliers. The war had found a new tool. Lieutenant Jack Turner flew his 23rd mission over the South Pacific in March 1943, piloting a B-17 loaded with experimental ordnance. The payload consisted of fertilizer-based bombs, each casing packed with ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, a mixture the crew had started calling farmer bombs with uneasy humor. Turner's squadron had been briefed on the weapon 2 weeks earlier. The bombs were cheaper to produce, easier to transport, and, according to engineers, nearly as effective as conventional explosives against jungle targets. Turner didn't trust them. He'd seen too many experimental weapons fail, seen ordnance malfunction and endanger crews. But orders were orders. The target was a Japanese supply depot concealed beneath jungle canopy near the northern coast of New Guinea. Intelligence estimated 40 structures, possibly ammunition stores. The flight took 3 hours. Turner monitored fuel levels, checked engine temperature, kept formation tight. His bombardier, Sergeant Carl Briggs, lay prone in the nose compartment, adjusting the bomb sight. At 07:40 a.m., the squadron reached the coordinates. Flak bursts dotted the sky, black flowers blooming at altitude. Turner held course, trusting Briggs to time the release. The bomb bay doors opened with a mechanical grind. Briggs called the drop. 12 bombs fell in sequence, tumbling toward the green expanse below. Turner banked left, gaining altitude, watching through the side window. The first explosion came 4 seconds later. It was enormous. A fireball climbed 300 feet, wider than any blast Turner had witnessed. The shockwave rocked the bomber, rattling instruments. Secondary explosions followed as the depot's ammunition ignited. Smoke churned skyward, a black column visible for miles. Briggs stared through the nose glass, silent. Turner keyed the radio, reporting the strike. His voice was steady, but his hands shook on the yoke. The jungle below Turner's bomber continued burning for 2 hours after the strike. Reconnaissance flights later that afternoon photographed the site, a blackened crater nearly 400 feet wide, surrounded by shattered trees and debris. The Japanese supply depot had been obliterated. Structures were gone, reduced to splinters and ash. Intelligence analysts studied the images, comparing the damage to previous bombing runs. The fertilizer bombs had exceeded expectations. Their blast radius was wider, their incendiary effect more sustained. Jungle foliage, damp and resistant to conventional fire, had ignited and burned intensely. The analysts wrote detailed assessments, noting cost efficiency and tactical advantages. Turner's squadron returned to base in Australia that evening. The crews were quiet, subdued by what they'd witnessed. In the debriefing room, an intelligence officer asked Turner to describe the explosion. Turner chose his words carefully. "Bigger than expected," he said, "much bigger." The officer made notes, asked about altitude, visibility, and payload performance. Turner answered each question, but his mind kept returning to the fireball, the way it had seemed to consume the sky. That night, he wrote a letter to his wife in Oregon. He didn't mention the mission specifics. Censorship regulations forbade it, but he wrote about exhaustion, about the weight of responsibility. He sealed the envelope and left it with the mail clerk. In Washington, reports from the New Guinea strike reached the Ordnance Department within 48 hours. Engineers reviewed the data, cross-referenced it with earlier tests, and recommended immediate production increases. Contracts were expanded. Factories in the Midwest began converting agricultural facilities to manufacture the fertilizer compound in bulk. By April 1943, production had tripled. The farmer bombs were no longer experimental. They were standard issue. Captain Ethan Bell arrived at an Allied airbase in northern Australia in May 1943, assigned to oversee ordnance logistics for bomber squadrons operating in the Pacific Theatre. The base sprawled across flat scrubland, rows of tents and prefabricated buildings baking under relentless sun. Bell's role was coordination, ensuring that munitions reached the right units at the right time, that supply lines remained functional despite distance and disruption. The fertilizer bombs had become a logistical priority. Their production was simpler than conventional explosives, requiring fewer rare materials and less specialized equipment. Bell worked with engineers to streamline delivery, arranging shipments from American factories to forward bases across the Pacific. The bombs arrived in wooden crates, each marked with stenciled warnings and handling instructions. Bell inspected the shipments personally, checking for damage, verifying quantities. The crews appreciated the weapon's effectiveness, but some expressed unease about its volatility. Bell listened to their concerns, documented them, and forwarded reports to his superiors. The feedback was consistent. The bombs worked, but they required careful handling. Any impact or excessive heat could trigger premature detonation. Bell issued stricter storage guidelines, mandating climate-controlled facilities and reinforced bunkers. He also coordinated with flight crews, ensuring that bombardiers understood the weapon's characteristics. By June, the system was functioning smoothly. Thousands of bombs moved through the supply chain each week, distributed to squadrons across the theatre. Bell kept meticulous records, tracking every crate, every shipment. The numbers grew staggering. In 3 months, over 40,000 fertilizer bombs had been delivered to forward bases. Bell reviewed the figures late one night, alone in his office. The lamp cast shadows across the paperwork. He thought about the Ohio farm where it had started, the accidental mixture that had become an instrument of war. The irony wasn't lost on him. War transformed everything it touched, even the soil. General Stanley Hughes studied maps of the Pacific Theater in his command tent near Port Moresby, New Guinea, in July 1943. Japanese forces still held strong positions across the region, fortified islands and jungle bases that resisted conventional assault. Hughes needed advantages: tactical, material, psychological. The fertilizer bombs provided one. Their cost-effectiveness allowed for saturation bombing, overwhelming enemy positions with sheer volume. Hughes planned a campaign leveraging this capability, targeting Japanese supply routes and strongholds with coordinated strikes. He briefed his staff on the strategy, emphasizing speed and concentration. The bombs would soften defenses, disrupt logistics, create openings for ground forces. His officers raised questions about reliability, about the risks of using relatively untested ordnance on such a scale. Hughes acknowledged the concerns but pressed forward. The alternative was slower progress, higher casualties, prolonged conflict. He authorized the campaign in late July. Over the following 3 weeks, Allied bombers flew 62 missions, dropping over 15,000 fertilizer bombs on Japanese positions across New Guinea and nearby islands. The results varied. Some strikes achieved devastating effects, obliterating targets and demoralizing enemy troops. Others fell short, the bombs failing to detonate or producing weaker blasts than anticipated. Hughes reviewed after-action reports, noting the inconsistencies. The weapon was powerful, but imperfect, its performance dependent on factors that weren't fully understood. Humidity, storage conditions, handling precision. He ordered further testing, refinements to the mixture and casing design. Engineers worked to stabilize the compound, adjusting ratios and adding binding agents. The improvements helped, but variability persisted. Hughes accepted it. War was never clean, never predictable. The fertilizer bombs were a tool, flawed but useful. He continued the campaign into August, adapting tactics as he learned the weapon's limits. The pressure on Japanese forces increased. Supply lines faltered. Morale declined. Hughes saw the shift in intelligence reports, the indicators of strategic erosion. The bombs were working, not perfectly, but enough. Lieutenant Jack Turner flew his 41st mission in September 1943. Exhaustion etched into every movement. The heat inside the cockpit was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of fuel and sweat. His crew had been operating continuously for 4 months, with only brief rest. Periods between missions. Turner's hands ached from gripping the yoke, his vision blurred from sleepless nights. The target that day was a Japanese airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea, a facility intelligence believed housed fighter squadrons that had been harassing Allied bombers. Turner's B-17 carried 20 fertilizer bombs, each weighing 500 pounds. The flight took 2 hours. Turner fought to stay alert, relying on his co-pilot to monitor instruments. Over the target, flak was heavy, bursting close enough to rattle the fuselage. The bombardier released the payload at 08:15 a.m. Turner didn't watch the explosions this time. He turned the bomber toward home, focused only on altitude and fuel. The return flight was uneventful until the final approach. One of the engines began overheating, temperature gauges climbing into the red. Turner reduced power, adjusted mixture settings, coaxed the bomber toward the runway. They landed hard, tires screeching, the damaged engine trailing smoke. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft as Turner shut down systems. He climbed out of the cockpit, legs unsteady, and walked to the debriefing tent. The intelligence officer asked routine questions. Turner answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere. That night he sat outside his tent, staring at the stars. A mechanic approached, offering a cigarette. Turner declined. They stood in silence for a while. "You all right?" the mechanic asked. Turner nodded, though it wasn't true. He was wearing down, fraying at the edges. The missions blurred together, each one bleeding into the next. He thought about the bombs, the fireballs, the jungle burning. He wondered how much longer he could keep flying. In October 1943, Allied forces launched a coordinated offensive across the Central Pacific, targeting Japanese-held islands with combined air and naval assaults. The fertilizer bombs played a central role, used to neutralize coastal defenses and clear landing zones for marine infantry. The weapon's effectiveness in jungle environments translated well to island warfare, where dense vegetation and concealed fortifications challenged conventional tactics. Bombing runs preceded every amphibious landing, carpeting beaches and inland positions with explosives. The results were mixed, but generally favorable. Japanese defenses, already strained by supply shortages and attrition, struggled to withstand the onslaught. Intelligence reports documented the impact: destroyed bunkers, shattered communication lines, demoralized troops. The bombs created conditions for successful landings, reducing casualties during the critical first hours of assault. But the cost was high. Allied losses continued to mount, not from the bombs themselves, but from the broader campaign's intensity. Crews flew beyond safe limits. Aircraft suffered mechanical failures, and accidents claimed lives. In one incident, a B-17 carrying fertilizer bombs crashed on takeoff, the payload detonating and killing the crew along with 12 ground personnel. The explosion cratered the runway, halting operations for 3 days. Investigations revealed that the bombs had been improperly secured, shifting during acceleration and triggering sympathetic detonation. New protocols were implemented, but the incident underscored the weapon's volatility. By November, over 100,000 fertilizer bombs had been deployed across the Pacific theater. The scale of production and use was unprecedented, a testament to both industrial capacity and tactical desperation. Engineers continued refining the mixture, seeking greater stability without sacrificing explosive power. Progress was incremental. The weapon remained dangerous both to the enemy and to those who handled it, yet it persisted, embedded in the machinery of war because it worked well enough and cost little enough. In Washington, analysts calculated the strategic value, weighing effectiveness against risk. The numbers supported continued use. The campaign advanced. Lieutenant Jack Turner flew his final mission in December 1943, a strike against a Japanese naval facility on the coast of New Britain. His crew had been rotated back to Australia for rest 2 weeks earlier, but a shortage of experienced pilots brought them back to active duty sooner than planned. Turner didn't protest. He was too tired to argue, too numb to care. The mission briefing was routine: coordinates, altitude, payload, 20 fertilizer bombs, target a dock and fuel depot. Expected resistance was moderate. Turner prepped the bomber with his crew, running through checks with mechanical precision. They took off at dawn, climbing through grey clouds into open sky. The flight was smooth, no flak, no fighters. At 09:30 a.m., they reached the target. The bombardier called the drop, and the bombs fell. Turner banked, beginning the turn for home. Then the explosion came. It was larger than anything they'd seen before, a blast so intense it lit the sky like lightning. The shockwave hit the bomber broadside, throwing it sideways. Turner fought the controls, struggling to level out. The right wing dipped, engines screaming. For 10 seconds he thought they'd go down. Then the bomber stabilized. Turner exhaled, sweat soaking his shirt. Behind them, the naval facility was gone, replaced by a pillar of smoke and fire. His co-pilot stared back at it, silent. When they landed, ground crews found stress fractures in the wing structure. The bomber was grounded for repairs. Turner submitted his report, noting the explosion's unexpected magnitude. Engineers investigated, theorizing that the bombs had struck a fuel depot or ammunition cache, triggering a massive secondary blast. The exact cause was never confirmed. Turner didn't care. He'd survived. 3 days later, orders came through. His crew was being rotated stateside for training duty. Turner read the orders twice, barely believing them. The war, for him, was ending. By January 1944, the fertilizer bombs had become a standard component of Allied bombing campaigns across the Pacific. Production facilities in the United States operated at full capacity, churning out thousands of bombs each week. The mixture had been refined through iterative testing, ratios adjusted, binding agents added, casing designs improved. The weapon was more stable now, though still unpredictable under certain conditions. Military strategists incorporated it into doctrine, pairing it with conventional ordnance to maximize destructive impact. The bombs were particularly effective against infrastructure, bridges, roads, supply depots, where their blast force and incendiary properties caused lasting damage. Japanese forces adapted, dispersing assets and fortifying positions underground. The cat and mouse continued, each side adjusting tactics in response to the other. Allied losses decreased as island-hopping campaigns gained momentum, but the grinding nature of the war persisted. In Washington, Captain Ethan Bell reviewed casualty reports and resource expenditures. The fertilizer bombs had proven their value, reducing the need for rare materials while maintaining offensive pressure. Bell calculated that the weapon had saved the military an estimated $40 million in production costs over 18 months. He included the figure in a report to the Ordnance Department, along with recommendations for post-war applications. The response was non-committal. The war still demanded focus. Peacetime considerations were premature. Bell filed the correspondence and returned to logistics. In Australia, ground crews loaded bombers with the familiar wooden crates. Stenciled warnings faded from handling. The routine had become second nature. Some crews had flown 50 missions or more, dropping fertilizer bombs on targets across thousands of miles. The weapon was no longer novel, no longer remarkable. It was simply part of the war, unremarkable in its ubiquity. As spring approached, Allied forces prepared for new offensives, targeting the Philippines and other strategic positions. The fertilizer bombs would be there, crated and ready, another tool in the vast machinery of conflict. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945, following Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fertilizer bombs, by then a footnote in the broader narrative of the conflict, faded from prominence. Production ceased within weeks of the surrender announcement. Factories that had manufactured the compounds transitioned back to agricultural purposes or shut down entirely. The remaining stockpiles, thousands of bombs stored in depots across the Pacific, were gradually dismantled or destroyed. The process took months, complicated by the weapon's instability and the sheer volume of ordnance. In Ohio, William Taylor continued farming, unaware of his mixture's role in the war. No one contacted him. No official recognition came. The Agricultural Survey from 1941 remained buried in military archives, a document without context or ceremony. Taylor planted corn and soybeans, tended his fields, and aged quietly. He died in 1952, his obituary noting his service to the community and his dedication to the land. Lieutenant Jack Turner returned to Oregon in early 1944, assigned to training duty at an airbase outside Portland. He spent the remainder of the war teaching navigation and bombing techniques to new crews, passing on lessons learned over the Pacific. After demobilization in 1946, he worked as a commercial pilot, flying freight routes along the West Coast. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, and when he did, he focused on the camaraderie, the routine, the mechanics of flying. The fertilizer bombs weren't mentioned. They were part of a chapter he'd closed. Turner retired in 1968 and spent his final years in a small town near the coast. He died in 1979. Captain Ethan Bell remained in the military after the war, eventually rising to the rank of colonel. He served in logistics roles during the Korean War and retired in 1962. His post-war reports on ordnance efficiency were studied at military academies, contributing to evolving doctrines around resource management and tactical innovation. Bell never wrote about the fertilizer bombs specifically, though his work touched on broader themes of adaptation and improvisation in wartime production. The legacy of the fertilizer bombs was quiet, absorbed into the larger history of World War II without fanfare or extensive documentation. Military historians occasionally reference the weapon in studies of ordnance development, noting its cost-effectiveness and tactical utility, but it never achieved the iconic status of other innovations: radar, the atomic bomb, long-range bombers. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem, effective within its scope, but ultimately overshadowed by more dramatic advancements. In the decades following the war, ammonium nitrate-based explosives found widespread use in commercial industries, mining, construction, demolition. The chemistry was well understood by then, its applications refined through both civilian and military experience. The connection to the improvised wartime weapon faded, replaced by industrial standardization. Few people remembered the Ohio farm, the accidental mixture, the desperate adaptation that had turned agriculture into ordnance. The story existed in fragments, military reports, pilot logs, production records, scattered across archives and rarely examined. In 1987, a researcher compiling a history of unconventional weapons stumbled across references to the fertilizer bombs in declassified documents. She traced the trail backward, finding the agricultural survey, the depot tests, the mission reports. She wrote a brief article for a military history journal detailing the weapon's development and use. The article attracted little attention, published in a specialized forum with limited readership, but it preserved the narrative, ensured that the story wouldn't vanish entirely. The last known stockpile of fertilizer bomb casings was discovered in a storage facility in the Philippines in 1993, corroded and inert. They were disposed of according to safety protocols, melted down for scrap metal. With that, the physical remnants of the weapon disappeared. What remained was memory, imperfect and incomplete, held in documents and the fading recollections of those who had lived through the war. And perhaps that was fitting. The fertilizer bombs were never meant to be remembered, never designed for legacy. They were born from necessity, used for a purpose, and discarded when that purpose ended. They were, in the end, exactly what they appeared to be: a temporary solution to an urgent problem, effective enough to matter, forgettable enough to fade.